Greetings. My name is Nick McCarthy, and I'm the Director of Programming at NewFest, New York's leading LGBTQ film and media organization. Earlier this week, we hosted the finale premiere of Season 1, Part 1 of HBO Max's Generation in partnership with our friends at HBO Max, as well as Campus Pride and the Phluid Project. We also hosted an exciting panel with the creators and cast that we're delighted to share with you now. If you haven't yet watched this groundbreaking series, you can stream all 8 episodes on HBO Max now, and then come back to watch the panel. Now, please enjoy this conversation with some of the wonderful and brilliant minds behind Generation, moderated by the editor-at-large at Them, Michael Cuby.
Hello, everyone, and thanks so much for sticking around after our virtual premiere of the Season 1, Part 1 finale episode of Generation. We want to remind everyone who just watched the episode and are now joining us for the panel to please refrain from revealing any spoilers on social media or any other public channels until after the episode premieres on HBO Max this Thursday, April 1st. That being said, my name is Michael Cuby, and I am the editor-at-large for Condé Nast's LGBTQ platform, Them, and I am so excited to be moderating this panel today with some of the creators, writers, and actors on this incredible show. Thank you to HBO Max, NewFest, Campus Pride, and the Phluid Project for hosting this conversation. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our panelists today, starting with Zelda Barnz, the co-creator, executive producer, and writer for Generation. Daniel Barnz, co-creator, executive producer, writer, and director. Christina Nieves, a writer who also wrote this finale episode. Justice Smith, who plays Chester. And Lukita Maxwell, who plays Delilah. Let's just dive right into it. I'd love to start by asking both Zelda and Ben about the creation of this show, which feels both timeless but decidedly of this particular moment. So kind of just to start, why did you think that now was the time to make a show that really aimed to speak about the realities of what it means to be a Gen Z teen today?
Yeah, I definitely think for me, a big part of it was growing up in a time where I've seen so much queer acceptance and I've seen such a shift in attitude of how people think about sexuality and queerness and how open people are to it now. I think has changed a lot from, for example, when my parents were teenagers, and kind of seeing that shift and witnessing that and being a part of the queer community in this time, I felt like it was a really interesting topic to kind of dive into with the show. And part of the creation from this show came from my own coming out. It was very much inspired by the queerness in my family and the celebration of queerness that I was starting to see in the world around me.
Yeah, we're a fully queer household. Ben, my husband, Zelda's dad, and Zelda's younger brother, Dashiell. And so a lot of the show kind of came out of some really poignant and funny conversations that we were having around our dinner table about queerness and how queerness looks so different for all of us. And so that was part of the sort of the genesis of the show and wanting to kind of explore that and to really celebrate what it looks like to be a queer Gen Z person today and how there's a kind of openness and boldness that didn't quite exist in the same way for Ben and me when we were younger. And so we really wanted to see if we could create a show that would celebrate that.
Of course. There's a long lineage of teen shows. When conceiving of the show, what are some of the main ways you were thinking that your show would be different to other teen shows of the past and offer something new to the conversation?
Yeah, I've seen a lot of really amazing teen shows with a lot of really amazing queer representation, but one of the things that I think makes Generation stand out from other teen shows is that it's completely rooted in queerness, and all the main characters, or most of the main characters, identify in some way as LGBTQ+. And that was really interesting for us to kind of explore, because I do feel as though I often see queer characters getting pushed to the side in a lot of media. And I think it's really important to have queer characters who are centered in media and who celebrate their identities.
And also something that was so important to Zelda from the get-go is that the queerness shouldn't be, the sort of the be-all and end-all of these character stories. That, something that she and I really wanted to do with the show is to have queer characters who storylines could be about their queerness, but also not about their queerness, and that you kind of move fluidly between that. And so it's sort of not queer erasure, but it's not that if you have a queer character, their storyline has to be about, bullying or coming out, and that we could really find sort of a balance where these characters could be queer and could also just be people.
Yes, of course. Christina, I would love to kind of pose this question to you since you were a part of the writer's room. When you guys were kind of coming up, specifically because as Zelda said, there's so many of the main characters are queer. How did you and the rest of the writers kind of come together to create all these queer characters that felt so nuanced and not like all they had to offer to the story was their queerness? That hasn't really been the trend in the past. So how did you guys avoid falling into the cliches that we normally see, specifically because there were so many different queer stories to explore across all of the different characters?
Yeah, I mean, I am but a humble servant, first of all. So all credit goes to Zelda and Daniel for, day one we got there and these characters already felt so fully sort of formed and were already living, breathing entities that we could just kind of allow to speak to us, I feel like. And also, their credit for staffing the room with people that could bring their own personal experiences as fully living, breathing queer people, which almost all of us were, and just be like, this was my high school experience. This was my first love experience. This was, one of my first sexual experiences, and just stay authentic to the way we lived those moments. And always using Zelda as our guide of like, nah, we don't do it like that no more. And we'll be like, okay, cool. And then the lovely moments that we saw were totally still, 20 or whatever, how many years later, we're still very much the same, and had that universality to it of, whether it's 2021 or in the 80s or whenever, those experiences often like rang true to all of us, which is cool to discover as well.
Yeah, we were always looking to find that right balance of a show that could feel like it was kind of authentic and spoke to Gen Z, but also would tap into sort of feelings from older people like, oh, yeah, I remember. That's exactly what it felt like. And maybe these people are kind of look different and they're speaking differently, but like, oh, yeah. And I do also want to just say about, it was our writer's room was great. It was, with the exception of one person, fully queer, and he's kind of like queer adjacent. So it was like, it was sort of like a fun dynamic to have in the room because, what it meant was that we could, there was sort of a base level. It's like, there wasn't that education that sometimes has to go in when you're like the one queer person having to explain like, why you don't want to see just another typical coming out story. And it was very like refreshing and empowering. And we were all sort of there to kind of like check each other and say like, oh, you know what? I feel like we've seen that before. Like, let's move beyond, like, let's do something different. And that can only come in an environment that was like majority queer.
Of course, yeah. I'd love to open it up to Justice. You've been acting for years, but I believe that Chester is probably one of the first really explicitly queer characters that you've gotten the chance to be able to portray on a broader level. And as a queer actor yourself working in Hollywood, how did you feel to get the chance to play someone who was so comfortable in his queerness? And how did you connect to him on the page? What was that experience like?
Well, I mean, I was honored that he was the first queer character that I played. I mean, I played a queer character in like, this play that I produced at a community theater in high school. But besides that, like Chester was like my first, and I just was so grateful that this was a person who was not in any shape or form superficial, that he had layers from the get-go. And it was someone that I had reference for in my personal life. Like I had met this guy 10 times over, 100 times over. And which is why I didn't even really audition for Chester at first, because I thought that they were just going to cast the guy. And then when I went in, I was like, oh, I actually feel like this character is so safe in my hands. One, because of the identities that I share with him, but moreover because I have so much reference for him, and that's what I set out to do as an actor, is to kind of mirror that human experience. And Chester is a story as a person, and a story that hasn't really been told, or when it has been told, it's like Zelda was saying, it's been marginalized. And here we are taking this bold, unapologetically queer person and centralizing them and showing the depth of them. And it's just like, I'm just so grateful that I can be a part of that like revolution, that queer television history like revolution.
Yes, and kind of going off of that for both you and Lukita, I mean, you're both younger actors portraying younger characters, these fully nuanced, kind of defined characters. Did you find yourself kind of tapping into some of your own like recent experiences and seeing overlap with maybe not specifically your own characters, but with some of the things that were happening within the show overall?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I'm also from Anaheim, where the show takes place. So I very much was like blown away by how accurate it portrays Anaheim and Orange County in general, and like queerness within Orange County. And also, I mean, Kita is closer to she's, how old are you now, Kita? 20? 19? How old are you?
I'm 19.
19. So she's a little bit
19,
closer
19.
to, she's like pure Gen Z. And I'm a Zillennial is what they call them. So while I shared some similar experiences, it's been, expansive for me to like not only be a part of a project that's created by someone actually of that generation, and be able to access like their mind to be like, is this accurate? But also to be working alongside fellow actors who are also of that generation, who are like, this is what we do, and to like look at Lukita's TikToks and be like, I'm like, okay, wait, what is she doing? I'm gonna copy what she's doing.
Same question to you, Lukita.
I grew up in a very conservative community, and so I had not the experience that the kids in generation had as much. I didn't have a community to like openly talk to about my queerness or how I even identified or anything anything like that. So I wish I had this show to watch when I was a kid. It's just the representation in it is so exciting to see. And honestly, when the first time I saw the episodes, I just burst into tears because I feel like it was the first time I had seen myself represented in bits of all these characters. It was just so heartwarming. Yeah.
I think the show has already, resonated with so many people, particularly members of Gen Z, like the people that are being represented. This is for kind of anyone who wants to answer. Why do you think this show has had such an immediate, profound impact on the younger audience?
Well, Gen Z is a very queer generation. Gen Z, I recently read a statistic that said something along the lines of 1 in 6 members of Gen Z who are adults identify as queer. And I think that's kind of amazing, just how it's so much more accepted in Gen Z, I think, than in a lot of other generations. And so I think that seeing queerness accurately represented on screen has been really important to my generation.
I would also just jump in to say that I think that it's really helpful to have a Gen Z creator behind it. And, I think what Zelda does for all of us, writers and cast, is keep pointing out things that we might not even realize about other teen shows and the way that teens are represented when they are written by adults. And she often talks about how there's sometimes a filter of nostalgia, or sometimes even sort of weird judgment that is like creeps into characterizations that we're not even aware. And to give an example, Zelda was from the get-go really wanted to make sure that we were embracing the language of social media in the show, and treating it as the language of Gen Z. That's what it is, right? I mean, they are speaking in social media, and so we really wanted to embrace that in the show. But she pointed out that oftentimes there's so much judgment that comes with social media, particularly from adults, like the sort of the put your phone down kind of thing, and and she wanted us to make sure that we were sort of respecting the fact that social media, yes, can be a bit of a brain drain sometimes, but also it's like a way of finding community and finding connectiveness. And that's one of the sort of the core themes of the show. So, and then other things, I mean, when we were casting it, to make sure that we were casting actors who looked like teenagers, who had body types that felt like teenagers, because even though we can watch, teen shows and be like, oh, that guy looks way too old, and there's like a more insidious effect that can sometimes, I think, teenagers can experience when they're watching, people with these like incredibly ripped abs portraying teenagers. And so I hope, I mean, look, I love the fact that you're saying that it's resonating. That's amazing. And I think the hope had always been from the get-go that having this sort of North Star teen creator, behind it would keep us all really focused on figuring out how to portray these characters in a way that would really connect with audiences of that age.
So something that was also really powerful to me, and maybe is also why a lot of Gen Z connects to it, is that it is a show about queerness and about sexuality, but we don't ignore like the other aspects of identity in the show, specifically race. And I find that often shows that focus on race ignore queerness, and then that focus on queerness ignore race, and everybody's sort of like a-racial. And this is like one of the first shows, and then, which is why I'm such a fan of the show. I mean, I'm a part of it, but I'm also like a huge fan of the show, is because it's like they're normal people. They go about their day, but they're also like they experience, things that have to do with their race, which is like, I don't know. I just feel it's like, it's crazy that's something that like you would yearn for from teen content, because it seems like a given, but like there are so many teen shows that are just like, it's like, yeah, your cast is incredibly diverse, but it's like, why is no one talking about race? Like I talk about race on a daily basis. Like I'm a person of color. Like that's what people do, and so it's just like, it's so refreshing to have like be a part of a show where it's like, I am all of my being, and then some, and yet my life conflicts aren't about that. They're about so much more, Yeah.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that's kind of like part of, in general, just like how nuanced these characters are. That again, like it's not characters that are completely defined by their queerness. They can be defined by so many other things and are dealing with so many other things while also still being queer, that it's just one aspect of many. But I think part of why I think Gen Z is so open and accepting of queer identity is kind of how immersed they are in social justice and activism, and how used they are to kind of having these conversations about people who at one point or another might have been considered minorities. Like for instance, like Lukita, your character in particular is very attuned to social justice initiatives and stuff like that. So, kind of going back to Daniel and Zelda and Christina, when you were writing these characters and kind of like having all these characters have these discussions, even in very kind of relaxed, outside of like very, classroom settings, just in very relaxed ways, just kind of discussing very freely elements of their identity in these very kind of like informed ways. Was that important for you to include?
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely think, the most important thing when we were crafting the show and writing the show was just authenticity and realism. We really did want this show to feel as real and relatable as possible. And these are conversations that I'm having with my friends, and these are conversations that I see other people having, and we wanted to include that in this friend group too, because that does feel like a real part of life.
We're also, we're a very irreverent household, sometimes like maybe too irreverent. And I think we wanted to sort of see if we could create a show that would celebrate the the like incredible maturity and wherewithal, you know, of Gen Z, and like you think about these heroes that Greta Thunberg's and the Emma Gonzalez's of the, you know, of the world, and it was like, I feel like some of these characters in our show are kind of in that you know, they're in that mold a little bit. Like they have that ability to kind of like step up in these like phenomenal ways. So we wanted to kind of do that, and I think, you know, we'll probably talk about this a little bit when we get into the, you know, this episode specifically, because this episode is really about, you know, showing how a group of teenagers can come together and make this like incredibly responsible and amazing decision together. And at the same time, we also wanted to, you know, have a little bit of fun with it. And, you know, Lukita, you can probably speak to this more, but Delilah, you know, we wanted Delilah to sometimes kind of go overboard a little bit, you know, and go on her rants about, you know, the Disney characters and you know, and why they're terrible. And, you know, and just like, let it be a show that both celebrates kind of, you know, social justice activism, and also, you know, make sure that it wasn't trying to seem preachy or take itself too seriously at the same time.
Of course.
Fact, yeah, I feel like, do you want to do that monologue for us? Because no, it's literally like one of my favorite. That's in episode 4. It's just like one of my favorite things. So when they're sitting in the GSA meeting, for anybody who hasn't seen it, and then you know, and they're talking about like what kind of, you know, event they should do as a GSA, and they get somebody suggests a gay day at Disney, and then Delilah's character goes in this whole thing about how Disney's so problematic. Sorry, anybody who loves Disney, but you know,
it's my favorite, and Lukita did it so well. She did it so funny and so different every single time, and
it's amazing. I mean,
it's
just literally
so good.
Like, oh, just it's so problematic. Just the way she says that like problematic thing. Oh my god, it's just gold.
Yeah.
You guys are so sweet.
It is a phenomenal monologue. Yeah, I'd love to kind of talk about some like specifics of this you know, part 1 finale. Going to justice, you know, this episode kicks off with Chester coming to school and this very noticeably different outfit, something you would never expect this character to be wearing, which obviously I think is meant to kind of highlight just how much, you know, this character is going through something in this moment, but it also it forces you to kind of reckon with how much Chester has used fashion as a form of self-expression in the past, because you see him in something so noticeably different, and it's like, oh God, something is very much up. You know, we're meant to believe that he's abandoned his usual wardrobe because of the response that he got from the rejection from Sam in the previous episode. But in your own words, why do you think that his response to kind of dealing with that would be to essentially change and abandon something that has seemed so important to him in the past?
It's because he wants to be invisible. You know, his clothes are such an expression of his soul, and Chester has taught me a lot about like the artistry of fashion and the storytelling of it. And I always work with Shirley, and I make sure that every single ring and bracelet that I'm wearing for a costume is like, it's an expression of how Chester is feeling that day, or the story that he's trying to tell about himself. And he experiences this like this you know, shattering of disillusionment when Sam rejects him, you know, after putting himself out there, you know, really begging to not be alone anymore, begging to be seen, and to be cared for, and is rejected. And it's like, it just causes him to retreat and abandon like the thing that he sets out every day to do, which is to be seen. It's like, it's the lowest of the low, you know, he's completely swallowed by that solitude but in that same vein, like his clothes are always an expression of how he's feeling. So it's like, this is how I'm feeling invisible. I'm feeling gray and sad and lonely. And I think it's ironic because it's like, I think he's like, true loneliness is conformity, you know. It's like he wants so desperately to be loved for his like idiosyncrasy, like his uniqueness, and then when he's rejected, he like escapes into the conformity, and it's like the full embrace of solitude. It's like it's a weird dichotomy, like, and I'm just kind of downloading right now, of like, I want to be seen, so I'm going to separate myself from the group, and then now I want to be not seen, so I'm going to, you know, assimilate. But yeah, that's what it's rooted in.
It was one of the great joys of working on the show is getting the costume fitting photos of Chester, you know, and like Shirley Carrata, our costume designer, is just like the most genius storyteller. And together, she and Justice would create these things that were like these incredible stories. And I remember when the first costume fittings came for this episode, and we saw Justice in these looks, and it was like the most soul bruising thing. It was like deeply, deeply upsetting to see him in this thing. It was like, I don't know, you just felt like something had been like ripped away. I've never had that experience before, just like looking at costume fittings before. I mean, sometimes they can be depressing for other reasons, but like this was genuinely depressing from a character perspective. And but it was something that, you know, it was an idea that, you know, Christina and Zelda and the other writers and I had early on about wanting there to be this moment, you know, where you would suddenly realize as an audience how important it was, you know, that to see Chester's character, to understand sort of the way that he looked was so much a part of the kind of the joy of him. And we knew that there had to be this moment where he would show up and not, and that would then create an effect, and that suddenly these other people who have been sort of, you know, milling around and maybe like a little passionlessly homophobic towards him, you know, would sort of note this change in appearance and be unsettled by it. And that in turn, you know, would, as Justice said, kind of like help Chester to realize that he is being seen actually in some ways that he didn't expect, and that would like help to lift him.
What's ironic is I used to dress like that in like 6th grade.
Me too.
Just gray polo, yeah.
Yeah.
One of the things I think that Justice just brought up when he's answering this question was the kind of exploration of this theme of loneliness, which I think kind of you can see throughout the show, but I think it's very interesting because in many ways, Generation is such kind of like a light, hopeful show. It's very funny, you know, there's like a lot of happiness and joy, but there also is you kind of notice, especially like on a rewatch, you notice that there are so many characters that are dealing with things that could kind of be tied back to this feeling of feeling lonely in one way or another. And so kind of going to, you know, Daniel, Zelda, and also Christina as like writers, how did you kind of figure out how to balance creating what is essentially, you know, like a light comedy while also figuring out ways to kind of loop in these explorations of something that's a somewhat darker subject?
Christina, what do you think? How did we do that?
I mean, I just remember us always going back to like the truth of whatever we were trying to tell, you know, because in that, like, shit is funny and it's heartbreaking and it's funny and it's heartbreaking, you know? And as we all shared our true stories, you know, about a lot of these things, like we were laughing and we were crying and we were laughing. And so I think like, again, like using Zelda as our like beacon of truth always, it really helped us to honor both the heart and also like the hilarity of everything that all of these characters were going through. And I have to share that before we were talking about, you know, how Gen Z connects so much to the show, all my family has been watching because they support me and they love me. And but they're not people that would, you know, seek out a show like Generation. You know, my parents, and you know, I come from, you know, mostly Christian family and kind of conservative adjacent. And one of my aunts called me bawling after watching the show, just so moved and so inside the stories of these characters. And so, I don't know, she had all kind of opinions about Megan, and she related, and she felt convicted, and she felt complicated. And we sat on the phone and just like cried and laughed about, again, our high school experiences, her like deep hope that kids never have to feel alone, that her kids would never feel alone. And all of that to say, I think it just speaks to, like, again, what the show is doing of really like telling universal stories in a really specific and like true way, that so many people can connect to.
When we very first started our writer's room, everybody had to bring in like a really embarrassing story from high school. Like all the writers had to tell. I don't think I think I brought in something that was like a stream of consciousness journal entry that I had written when I was in high school that was like literally the most pathetic, sad thing you've ever read in your entire life. Like I literally was upset because like my hydra didn't blossom in biology and like people picked on me in the school bus. Like it was so sad. But I think that out of that sort of those initial stories that we were telling, we did realize that like this is where we wanted the world of the show to live in, that sort of mixture of joy and pain, and that there are characters. I mean, we all experience loneliness, and there is and I think queer loneliness in particular was also it's kind of interesting. But what Zelda talks about so beautifully is like the teenage experience is you can be fucking like I'm sorry, I shouldn't have said that. You can bleep it out, but you can be like miserable, depressed, sad 1 second, crying, and then like laughing the next, and then like the next second you're watching like a video about climate change, and then the next second after that you're like, what are we going to get from the student store? And so I think we really wanted the show to live in that kind of tonal mishmash of what it is to be a teenager.
And I remember we talked a lot about too, like the stakes of things that,
yeah.
Like that there's such a mishmash of things that have the highest of stakes, whether it's a text message or what college you're going to get into, or, your first love, or your parents divorcing, and everything sometimes is like here, whether it's like Sephora's closing or like you're going to have a baby, it's kind of like all here. And I think that speaks to kind of the unique tone of the show.
Lukita, one of the moments that I think has stuck with me the most from this episode was when everyone is on their way to, drop the baby off at the firehouse, but we stop at Delilah's house. And she goes inside and she's kind of like looking around her room at, she's seeing like notebooks and school projects, and she stops at this photo of herself as like in her childhood. And I'm kind of like wondering, in your words, what do you think was kind of going through Delilah's mind that kind of like at that moment that gave her pause? Because obviously she is dealing with a lot in this moment after giving a surprise birth at a mall. And now
Delilah definitely has extreme tunnel vision when she has an objective and she's passionate about something and she needs to get something done. So I feel like she's in this moment trying to figure out what do I need to do, what do I need to do next. And in this bedroom, when she gets back to her bedroom, it's the first moment that I think she has a second to breathe and start to comprehend what has happened, even though she doesn't fully at all. And yeah, just looking around at her childhood bedroom, she was a kid this morning, and now everything seems so trivial. All of her school assignments on her bed and all of her stuffed animals all around her room. It's just so far removed from the world that she is living in at the second half of the day after everything has happened. And I think also she's feeling and I talked to Zelda and Daniel quite a bit about this, but she's so in control of everything, and for this crazy event to happen in her body, like her body betrayed her. That was something that she should be so in control in control of, and she wasn't. And I feel like in that moment, even talking about like the physicalities of how she's moving in the room, it's like it's different. She sits different in the space, and yeah.
Yeah, so I believe that we are nearing the end of our time now. So before we wrap things up, I would love to kind of pose one final question to all of you, which is essentially, kind of going back to, as we were talking about how much this show has resonated with, particularly with younger viewers, but what you all hope viewers, both young and old, will take away from the show and from this first season, what you hope they can learn about themselves, about others, and from essentially the show that has so much to say about the younger generation.
I want all gay people everywhere to be happy with the show. I just like really feel like, I'm so cool with straight people watching the show. Cool. You can watch the show too. And everyone can relate to it and connect to it and see themselves represented. But really, like, this show is created by queers, and like the majority of the cast is queer, and the majority of the writers are queer, and it's just like so much queerness. And we're like, here, queer people, is all of this queer goodness for you, like, because you deserve good things too. And every time I see people on Twitter or people in my DMs like talking about how, oh, I'm queer, I feel represented by this show, or this is the show I wish I had when I was in high school, or yada 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 yada. That's like, it's like that was the goal. That was always the goal, is like to like show people themselves, and like celebrate them and celebrate the progress we've made as a community. So that's what I hope people take away, and straight people can watch it too. Sure.
To piggyback off of that, when my dad called me after he watched the show, one thing he said that really moved me was, he said it made him realize everyone's always carrying something that you may not know. And which is a really deep thought for my father to have. So again, I was like, go us. And I love that as a takeaway. You never know what someone is carrying, and seeing that reflected is like, I hope it gives people a sense of I'm not alone, and a sort of extended community, and like Justice said, a feeling of I'm not alone. Somebody else has experienced my story too, and that's me. Recognition.
And to piggyback off of that, I think that the show really wants to celebrate chosen family. And I think that like what you see in these first 8 episodes is this group of people coming together. And yes, we see some of the families, but really the family in the show are these kids. And that's the family that they're creating for themselves. And I think, for me in, my own life, chosen family has been so central and so important. And I think to people watching and feeling like they maybe are seeing some of their loneliness on the screen. Like, I also hope that they're seeing that the ways that, that people can kind of connect and come together.
Yeah, absolutely. I hope a big takeaway from the show is just like, don't apologize for who you are. Not everyone will love you, but you will find people that do, and changing who you are is not going to change who cares about you for what reasons. So yeah, I don't know. I think that's been a very important theme with the show for sure.
Lukita, that leaves you.
Yeah, Lukita.
Queer love is beautiful.
Yes.
Yeah.
I completely agree. And yes, I think that is such like a great place to wrap up. I want to thank all of you for participating on this panel and for providing such thoughtful, insightful answers. I want to thank HBO Max, Nieves, Campus Pride, and the Phluid Project again for hosting this conversation. And I'd like to thank all of you as the viewers for sticking around to watch this incredible panel. And as a reminder, we ask that you please do not reveal anything about this season 1, part 1 finale until it airs later this week on Thursday, April 1st. And thank you so much, and I hope you enjoyed.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.